Asked our previous president of the Reston Historic Trust, Lynn Lilienthal, to come up and just say a word about how we operate, and then I'll introduce our speakers. So, Lynn.
Hi. Good evening.
Hi.
I just want to welcome you here. The Reston Historic Trust, which runs the Reston Museum on the other side of the plaza, sponsors these programs. We've been doing it now for about a year, and we are so happy because all of you seem to come, or more of you seem to come every month, and it's great. We hope that you will visit the museum and learn about the history of Reston. Reston, you know, is going to be 50 years old in 2014, so we're very historic, and that will be a big year for us. This is our brochure. We are also a nonprofit organization, a community organization, and we rely on all of you for your support. We don't charge for any of these lectures. They're all free, but we do have our little box over there, so if you feel like putting in a little money to help us, that would be great. And then we have a flyer over there of our upcoming programs. This is for September, October, and then November. We're going to take a little break in August. So they're all going to be exciting, they're all going to be interesting. Come back again and support us. Thanks.
And my name is Warren Bruce, in case we haven't had an opportunity to meet yet. And I help put these programs together. Our main speaker tonight is Bill Anderson, and Jim Lewis will be helping during the question and answer period. But Jim got his master's and bachelor's in history, and since age 12, he's been interested in the Civil War. So coming from Virginia, it's kind of hard not to be interested in what happened here 150 years ago. He was an Air Force intelligence officer for 3 years, and then spent 27 years with the agency, that's the CIA, as an analyst and also as a case or overseas manager. And what he does now, which is very interesting, is he does leadership seminars using the battlefields and the battles as examples. And so he's done over 200 of these where you many times go out to the battlefield. But Jim's going to be our speaker tonight, and without further ado, I'm just going to turn it over to him, and then and he'll kind of set the ground rules tonight in terms of Q&A, and then we'll go from there. So Jim, welcome.
Okay, the ground rules, yes. We're going to be talking about the second battle of Manassas or Bull Run. And we're going to use that to kind of set up the passage of both armies through our neighborhoods. So we'll be trying to link this battle. I call it the Rodney Dangerfield of Civil War battlefields, because you don't hear a lot about the second battle of Manassas or Bull Run. But in fact, it was pivotal in many ways, both tactically and strategically, for the Civil War. Now, I'm not really good when it comes to computer graphics. I did these slides, this PowerPoint, but I have found an updated, modern version of the old excuse that the dog ate my homework. So, if we have a puppy, his name is Mosby, because I'm interested in the Civil War. And so if I have any problems with the graphics this evening, by now you know why.
You gotta post that on YouTube.
I think that's where I got it, actually. If you have questions of fact, if there's something that I say that confuses you or you don't understand, please raise your hand and ask at the time, because otherwise you'll be thinking about it all evening. And others may have the same question too, and I'll try to repeat it so others can hear. If you have a question or you want to argue with me or debate with me on a point of Civil War history or what might have been, we'll have lots of time at the end for Q&A, and I would ask you if you would just be courteous to everybody else, not all of whom may have that same level of interest, to just hold those kinds of questions until the end. and we will get to them eventually. So if that works for everybody. Yes, that's a good idea. Please silence your cell phones. If you haven't done so already. I see lots of friends and acquaintances. At least I think they're still friends in the audience. So just the one other ground rule is no heckling, please. A little bit about my background with regard to the Civil War. I have relatives who served on both sides, both in the Confederate Army and in the Union Army. Three of them, and all three of them failed to survive the war. They all three died during the war. But because I have relatives on both sides, in Civil War circles, I'm known as an SOB. That's a son of both. Or you can refer to me as a bisexualist. Very carefully. Or you can just call me a bisexualist SOB. I've been called worse. But of course, we are, at this point, observing, certainly not celebrating, but we are observing the 150th anniversary of a very dark time in our American history. So I thought I'd start this out, not with a lot of background on the Civil War, but at least to ask the question, why do we care? Why are we having this lecture tonight? Why does the Civil War matter, or should it matter to us now? Well, for me, I think the answer is that it is a defining moment in our story, and that's what history is all about, is the story of our nation. Probably the most critical point in our history from the American Revolution until the present. It didn't really settle some of the main issues that were being fought over. The issue of slavery, and certainly, but race relations continue to still be a challenge for our country. And we continue to discuss, often politely, sometimes not so, the issues of strong federal government versus states' rights. So those issues are still with us 150 years later. And the other thing that we mustn't forget, and that is that it was a tragedy in the purest sense of that word, because for 4 years, Americans were killing each other in unprecedented numbers. By the end of the 4 years of the Civil War, April of 1861 to April of 1865, somewhere between 620,000 and 750,000 men and boys died. Probably another 40 to 50,000 civilians. We really don't know, and those numbers are always being adjusted up or down. But let's take the lower number, 620,000 deaths in 4 years. That would be the equivalent of the numbers and the emotion of people who were killed on 9/11 every week for 4 years. That's what was going on in this country. And the other thing that you need to remember about it is that it could have gone the other way. We look back at history 150 years and we say, well, the 11 states of the Confederacy really had no chance of prevailing against the much larger, much more heavily industrialized 23 states of the Union. But in fact, it could have gone the other way. And the period that we're going to be talking about, really July through September of 1862, is one of those periods pivotal in that struggle. Now, when I talk to groups of young people, they often talk about history as back in the day. It's either something they experienced in their lives or they lump it all together as back in the day, right? You've probably heard that term. And so I use this slide to ask them, well, just how long ago was it? 150 years ago does seem as if it's nothing that we could relate to at all. Well, this is a picture that was taken in 1918. This man on the right is my grandfather, Russell Glass. He was a sergeant in the American Expeditionary Force. He went to France and went over the top twice, was wounded, but survived, because I'm here. And this picture was taken when he was in training in Montgomery, Alabama. And he's shaking hands with a Confederate veteran on the steps of the Capitol in Montgomery, where Jefferson Davis was sworn in as president of the Confederacy. And my grandfather later went on to become a history teacher, so I come by that honestly, I guess. And this man told him first-hand stories about his experiences during the Civil War. Now, I knew my grandfather very well. He lived into my 30s. My younger son is named after him. And so he told me stories that he heard directly from a Confederate veteran, a person who actually was there and experienced the war. So how long ago is it really in terms of our memory? Well, the period that we're going to be talking about tonight, the late summer of 1862, was the most intense period of war experienced in Fairfax County during the entire Civil War. That was associated with the campaign of Second Manassas or Second Bull Run. There are a number of Civil War battles that had two names, one in the north and one in the south. So in the south, it's known as Second Manassas. In the north, it's known as Second Bull Run, which always raises the question, why is the national park named Second Manassas? But we don't have time for that discussion right now. Well, during this period, there were constant troop movements through our area, maneuvering and fighting as well. But before we get into that, I think it's worth going back a little bit, giving you a little bit of background of how they got here. In June of 1862, Union General George McClellan is in charge of the Union Army of the Potomac, 120,000 strong. It has bypassed Confederate defenses and landed on the peninsula. So here you see Washington, and here's Richmond, the capitals of the two countries, the United States and the Confederate States, only 100 miles apart. And instead of going straight overland and having to go through all these Confederate defenses, McClellan put his troops on boats, came down the Potomac River into the bay, and up the peninsula between the York and the James Rivers, and approached Richmond from that side. And it was working fairly well. There were Union soldiers who in June said that they could hear the church bells of Richmond on a Sunday. They were that close. And soon, many people on both sides were beginning to believe that Richmond would fall, and with it, possibly an early end or an end to the Civil War. Of course, they didn't know how long it was going to last at that time. It had been going on for about a year. But then, on the 1st of June, 1862, at the Battle of Seven Pines, just outside of Richmond, between these two armies, the Confederates defending the capital and McClellan's army, the Confederate commander at that time, Joe Johnston, was wounded. And President Jefferson Davis went to his military advisor, Robert E. Lee, and asked him to take command of the Confederate army in the field, which Lee did. After about 3 weeks of stalemate, during which Lee is preparing, reinforcing his army and getting ready, he takes the offensive. And beginning on the 25th, 26th of June, a series of 5 battles were fought, known as the 7 Days Campaign. During that campaign, McClellan is stunned by the attacks that Lee launches against him, and he gives up the siege of Richmond and actually goes on the defensive, and Lee never relinquishes that initiative. To quote Lee's summary of the campaign, on Thursday, the 26th of June, the powerful and thoroughly equipped army of the enemy was entrenched in works vast in extent and most formidable in character within sight of our capital. Today, the remains of that confident and threatening post lie upon the banks of the James River, 30 miles from Richmond, seeking to recover under the protection of the gunboats from the effects of a series of disastrous defeats. Now that's a pretty good summary of what had happened. It was the first significant Confederate victory since First Manassas a year ago. Lee's confidence in his men and his in them was unshaken. In 5 battles, he halts the Union offensive, and the Army of the Potomac is driven back to the James River and Harrison Landing. So it starts here, and then you see the names of the battles here: Mechanicsville, Gainesville, on down here to Malvern Hill, the last one. McClellan called this entire campaign a change of base, which it certainly was. But it might be a bit of an understatement. It was a fearful toll, however. In victory, the Confederates captured much-needed arms and supplies, but they suffered 20,000 casualties. The Union soldiers had actually fought very well and suffered 16,000 casualties of their own. It was their leadership, primarily George McClellan, who let them down, not the soldiers in the field. Lee then spends another month, most of July, finding replacements and reorganizing his army. After all, he suffered 20,000 casualties. And he officially redesignates this army the Army of Northern Virginia, and it will carry that name for the rest of the war. It's not the only Confederate army in the field, but it's by far and away the most famous one. Now, his leadership team emerges as well during this time. Lee is finding the people that he can trust and that he will work with. Jeb Stuart, in charge of his cavalry. Stonewall Jackson, in charge of one half or one wing of his infantry. And James Longstreet, the only non-Virginian on that close-knit group, in charge of the other half of his army or infantry. This is arguably the most effective leadership team in U.S. military history. Lee plans in detail, but he delegates and he expects his officers to use their judgment and initiative on campaign and particularly on the battlefield. Because with virtually no electronic communications, you can't wait for orders. Once you're on the battlefield, Lee expects his men to use their initiative rather than try to find him and ask them what they should do. And that leadership philosophy is inculcated in his men and works very effectively. Now, the effect of this campaign, the Overland Campaign, driving the threatening Union Army away from Richmond, is dramatic. The Richmond Inquirer, on the 4th of July, said this: "From out of the gloom and doom of the past, the martial spirit has emerged, and the skill and valor of our men over our brutal foe is incontestably established." The Northerners were stunned. The New York Times wrote, "The retreat of our army," the Union Army, "was entirely unexpected, and it shatters the high hopes which the country of late had indulged." Now, the reversal of fortunes on the peninsula, along with the bloody defeat at Shiloh in April, convinced many, including Lincoln, that the war is not going to be short. The beginning of the war, many thought it would last a few weeks or months at most, and it would be decided in a few battles. People are now becoming, after a year and thousands of casualties, they're coming to understand that the war could stretch on for years, and that it will be extremely bloody. And therefore, in the early summer of 1862, at his summer residence at the Old Soldiers' Home in Northwest Washington, which is still there, and you can visit it, and I would encourage you to do so if you haven't. It's a very nice museum. They do some very nice tours now. It's here that Lincoln begins to formulate what will be known as the Emancipation Proclamation. And it's more than a proclamation, it's actually a strategy with military objectives. Lincoln reasons slave labor support to the South. The slaves are not carrying weapons, regardless of what you've read recently. However, they are doing everything else that frees up white men in the Confederate Army to fight. They're digging ditches, they're driving wagons, they're cooking, they're building roads, they're working in hospitals. Also, the slaves are still providing labor on the home front to continue to run the farms and plantations in many places. Now, freed slaves also theoretically could be encouraged to join the Union Army. Therefore, and also it would take the war to a higher moral plane to end slavery. Emancipation has become, in Lincoln's words, a military necessity, absolutely essential to the preservation of the Union. We must free the slaves or ourselves be subdued. Decisive and extensive measures must be adopted. The slaves are undoubtedly an element of strength to those who have their service, and we must decide whether they should be with us or against us. And now in July, Lincoln presents to his cabinet the draft of the Emancipation Proclamation, which you see on the right. Most of the cabinet are in favor of it, but given the defeats they just suffered on the peninsula in the 7 days, Secretary of State Seward advises Lincoln to wait for a Union victory before issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, so that, as Seward said, it doesn't look like the last desperate gasp of an exhausted government. And Lincoln agrees, and therefore the draft goes back in his desk waiting what he hopes will be a reversal of Union fortunes on the battlefield. Well, on the 26th of June, the same day that Lee launched his 7 days offensive, President Abraham Lincoln takes another step. He summons to the White House General John Pope, the man you see here. He's asking Pope to do two things: provide more protection to the capital of Washington, but also to reinvigorate the Virginia front with outright aggression, in contrast to the very deliberate and reluctance to fight displayed by George McClellan. McClellan is also a Democrat and not at all opposed to slavery. You have to understand that the Army, particularly the Union Army at this time, is much more politically charged, much more politically divided than we would think of today. So whether you were Republican or Democrat, pro-slavery or anti-slavery, had career repercussions for you within the Union Army. Lincoln also moves to create a new Union Army for Pope, and he calls it the Army of Virginia, about 60,000 men, and it forms outside of Washington in the area around Manassas. So now, there are two Union armies in the field opposing Lee. Who is this man? Well, he is politically reliable. He's a Republican, and he's an abolitionist, so he opposes slavery. But he also is a military veteran. He has military experience. He's about 42 years old. He's a 20-year Army veteran. He went to West Point. He served in the Mexican War, so he has some sort of combat experience. His roommate at West Point was James Longstreet. Not uncommon thing to have happen during a civil war. There were a lot of times when people who had served together in the old Army, who had gone to West Point together, find themselves on opposing sides. And that's going to be the case here. Longstreet and Pope, and they will meet outside of Manassas. We'll get to that. He has Lincoln connections. His father was a judge in Illinois and a friend of Abraham Lincoln when he was a lawyer on the circuit in Illinois. And this is important to us Southerners. You Northerners may not understand the connection here. But he was a second cousin-in-law of Mary Lincoln. It's very important. He's also pompous, with an inflated ego, which unfortunately seems to have been a requirement for promotion in the Union Army at this time. And he quickly annoys everyone in the new command as he snidely comments that his new army lacks the courage of the Western soldiers that he's been used to commanding out in Tennessee. And he says, "My headquarters will be in the saddle. Success and glory are in the advance. Disaster and shame lurk in the rear," which prompts some to quip that he has confused his headquarters with his hindquarters. But he is determined. He is determined to fight a hard war. And part of that direction comes from Lincoln. He encourages his soldiers to steal food from Virginia farmers. He issues General Order Number 11, a proclamation demanding loyalty oaths from male civilians within Union lines. This is going to be mostly in Virginia since that's where his army is operating. And ordering the arrest and threatened execution of anyone found violating that oath. Now, Confederate officials are infuriated, not the least of which was Robert E. Lee, who uncharacteristically called Pope a miscreant who must be suppressed. Well, one thing that John Pope does do is advance. He goes on the offensive, and he's much more aggressive than McClellan has been. On the 12th of July, he moves much of his army south across the Rappahannock River and occupies Culpeper Courthouse. So he moves from the area around, closer to the capital, Washington's here, closer from the capital down the railroad line here to Culpeper, which is here. So he's moving toward Richmond, which is down here, threatening the capital and Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army from a new direction. Let me stop just a minute, because Culpeper isn't really Culpeper, okay? And Fairfax isn't really Fairfax. At this time, in 1862, Culpeper is known as Culpeper Courthouse because it's the county seat of Culpeper County, but its name, the official name of the town, is Fairfax. So what's Fairfax? Well, Fairfax is known as Fairfax Courthouse because it's the county seat of Fairfax County. But its name is actually Providence. Confusing, isn't it? And it isn't until the early 1870s, after the Civil War, that Culpeper solves all of this for us, thank goodness, and decides to call itself Culpeper, and therefore the name Fairfax is available, and Fairfax quickly snatches it up. So we've taken care of that today. So you'll hear me call them Fairfax Courthouse, and that's the same town we think of as Fairfax today. Because if I call it Providence, you're going to go, huh? So, we now have two armies. Pope is approaching, and McClellan is already stationary, but he's still threatening the capital of Richmond. Meanwhile, there are growing political pressures on Lincoln. On the 8th of July, Lincoln actually comes to Virginia and visits the Army of the Potomac, hoping to get General McClellan to either attack or at least retreat and join forces with Pope's army. McClellan isn't interested in withdrawal, and Lincoln is beginning to either withdraw or attack. He's pretty satisfied with just sitting there. And Lincoln is beginning to lose confidence in Little Mac, as he was known, or sometimes the Little Napoleon was another nickname the press liked to have for him. So on the 23rd of July, Lincoln's gone back to Washington. He acts. He replaces McClellan as General-in-Chief with Henry Halleck, the man you see on the right. George McClellan is in the center. And now, McClellan had two hats. He wore two hats. He was Commander-in-Chief of all Union armies, and he was the active commander of the Army of Potomac outside of Richmond. Now he's lost the more prestigious of the two jobs. He's no longer General-in-Chief. He's now reduced only to Commander of the Army of the Potomac. So now he has a couple of bosses over him. Henry Halleck and, of course, Abraham Lincoln. And as you can imagine, he is very unhappy with that demotion. And of course, he thinks it's totally unfair. As he noted many times in letters to his wife, I think that there might be different reputations for many Civil War generals if they had just not written home to write his offers. And then failed to burn the letters afterward. But what is happening on the Confederate side? Well, in early May, secretly, Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis have agreed strategically that at the first opportunity, they will take the war into the North. And this is the plan for how they are going to win the war without conquering the North. It's about hearts and minds. It's about making the war so terrible and costly in terms of human lives and in terms of treasure on the northern population, particularly the voting population, that they will stop supporting the war. And they will vote for the opposition party, the Democratic Party. So there is a very real opportunity here. They don't have to conquer the North, but if they can go into the North, invade Northern territory, and let northern population, northern voters feel what war is like, there's a great opportunity to win their independence in the northern ballot box. However, before Lee can carry out this ambitious plan, he's got two Union armies to deal with. He has to do something about George McClellan. He can't leave him sitting there with over 100,000 men threatening the Confederate capital. And now he has a new threat in John Pope and the Army of Virginia. On the 3rd of August, Henry Halleck, the new commanding general, orders McClellan to evacuate the peninsula and unite with Pope's army in Virginia. So if you look at these arrows and just reverse them. So now he's come all this way, made it all the way to the outskirts of Richmond. He's now back down his boats here, and he's just going to reverse the process. He's not doing anything here, and therefore it makes good sense to bring the army back to Washington and then reunite it with Pope's army out here somewhere in Virginia and look for another opportunity, but with a much larger combined force. Stunned by his demotion, Little Mac waits 3 weeks before he takes any action at all to comply with that evacuation order, offering a series of excuses for the delay. His jealousy of Pope's new status certainly has something to do with this. McClellan is going to make sure that most of his army will not reach General Pope in time to help him should he get into a scrape with Robert E. Lee's army. Politics on the Potomac. Finally, on the 22nd of August, Lee gets a break. Jeb Stuart's cavalry raids behind Pope's lines and captures Pope's dispatches, as well as his own personal wagon that contains his uniform and other personal equipment. But the dispatches are what are particularly important. They confirm that McClellan has orders to retreat, to leave the peninsula, ending the threat, the immediate threat to Richmond. That's the good news. The bad news to Lee is that unless he acts quickly, the two Union armies will unite, and then his 60,000-man army will be facing a combined Union force of 160,000. So he needs to act quickly, and he does. 2 days later, gathered around a table in a field north of Richmond, Lee lays out for his leadership team a very audacious plan. First, he's going to ask Stonewall Jackson, here, he's going to ask Stonewall Jackson to take almost half of the army, along with Stuart's cavalry, and move west and north across the Rappahannock River around Pope's right flank to cut off his main supply lines along the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, thus forcing Pope to retreat. At the same time, Longstreet will demonstrate to keep Pope busy so he doesn't realize what Jackson is doing. And then when Pope is forced to retreat, the two halves of Lee's army will reunite. And then, and this is Lee's idea, then once his army can reunite and Pope has been pushed out of the way, he's going to head north. He's heading for Maryland and Pennsylvania, the invasion that they've been talking about since May. So he'll fight the Union army if he must, but his first choice is to move away and head north. And so this map is showing that movement. When he asks Jackson how quickly he can be moving, Stonewall replies, "I will be moving within the hour." He wasn't quite that fast, but he was on the road by the next morning. So here you see Lee's army here. Jackson's going to take half of it with Stuart's cavalry and ride all the way around Pope, come in behind him, and hit the railroad junction down here. Here's the railroad. Pope's units are scattered out there, the blue units scattered out here. And Longstreet's job is to keep them focused on him here. On the 25th of August, Jackson launches his 24,000-man command on what is one of the war's greatest marches, covering 54 miles in 36 hours. They arc around Pope's right through the Bull Run Mountains at Thoroughfare Gap, which you pass through every time you take 66 and you go far enough west. It's a grueling march, causing many to straggle. Straggling is falling behind, not able to keep up with the fast pace. But Jackson drives his men relentlessly. As Brigadier General Lawton observed, he had no sympathy for human infirmity. He was a one-idea man. His troops feared him and obeyed him to the death, but be ye sure it was bitter hard work to keep up with Stonewall Jackson, as all know who ever served with him. Well, Jackson wasn't totally without humor. When his close friend, Jeb Stuart, the cavalryman, came up to him and said, "Look, Jackson, I've got Pope's coat." Remember, he captured Pope's uniform. Jackson replied, "General Stuart, I would much rather you have brought me General Pope than his coat." The day after this march, on the 27th of August, Jackson captures Pope's main supply depot at Manassas Junction, where the town of Manassas is today. It has huge warehouses bulging with commissary and quartermaster supplies. Jackson's men, who are pretty hungry, after all the marching and fighting that they've been doing, fall upon an enormous and undefended depot, pillaging warehouses and boxcars filled to the brim with not only cigars and whiskey, but lobster and wine, biscuits, cheese, ham, bacon, coffee, sugar, oysters, probably all at once. as well as clothes, which they desperately need. What cannot be consumed or carried off, Jackson orders to have destroyed, so that the Union Army, Pope's army, can't take advantage of this. Now with his supply base destroyed, Jackson has Pope's attention. And Pope does exactly what Jackson hoped he would do. And that is, he turns around to go after Jackson, assuming correctly that Lee has divided his force. And that if he moves quickly enough, he can gobble up Jackson and then Longstreet before Lee's army can get back together again. Pope says, "We shall bag the whole crowd." Unfortunately, Jackson isn't trying to escape. He's going to hide for a little while, and giving time for Lee and the rest, Longstreet and the rest of the army to catch up. But what he does is he moves away from Manassas Junction after they have, probably more slowly than they arrived, because they've been eating for a few hours. They head back towards Centerville, and then instead of going toward the Capitol, he moves away from the Capitol. This is the old stone bridge on the Manassas battlefield. Crosses it here, and then goes into hiding along the Stony Ridge. And this dotted line is an unfinished railroad that cuts and fills, that provides great natural or ready-made defensive position for him. And he just waits there, giving Pope a chance to find him. Pope has no idea where he is. Jackson is in regular contact with Lee and Longstreet, and he knows that the rest of the Confederate army is approaching through Thoroughfare Gap on the same route that he took, close enough to provide immediate support if necessary. He also knows from captured couriers that Pope's scattered units are approaching Manassas. So Jackson is the one who will make the decision that there's going to be a battle fought here. It is Jackson, rather than Lee, who decides to fight the battle of Second Manassas or Second Bull Run. Because remember, Lee would just as soon have got his army back together again and then immediately moved north. Jackson decides, no, we need to take care of Pope first. And how does he do that? Well, an hour before sunset on August the 28th, the next day, about 6 o'clock in the evening, Brigadier General Rufus King's Union Division is marching east along the turnpike in front of Jackson's concealed troops. When Jackson is informed, he mounts his horse and rides out to have a look. After a few minutes of examining the Union column, Jackson makes his decision. He gallops back to his command. To the waiting officers, he announces, "Bring out your men, gentlemen." And that's what you see here. The blue are Union